Welcome to the third in the series Ottomans Online, the Skilliter Center seminars on the Ottoman Empire and the early Turkish Republic. This talk will be given by Professor Yücel Yanıkdağ, who is Professor of History at the University of Richmond. Professor Yanıkdağ has published extensively on the social history of medicine in the late Ottoman Empire and early Turkish Republic, and on the cultural responses of Ottoman soldiers to the experience of the First World War. His book, Healing the Nation, Prisoners of War, Medicine and Nationalism in Turkey, 1914 to 1939, was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2013. His talk today is on military masculinity under fire, suffering and manliness in the Ottoman First World War. Just before I hand over to Professor Yanıkdağ, the next talk in our series will be on Thursday, January the 28th at 16:30 UK time, and will be given by Professor Jane Hathaway from the Ohio State University. Professor Hathaway will be speaking on the Cairo Geniza as a source for Ottoman history, ? I now hand over to Professor Yanıkdağ.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for the invitation as well. I'm happy to be part of it, this project, very excited about it. So I want to talk today a little bit about sort of my preliminary findings into sort of history of masculinities in the Ottoman First World War. A year after Arab Ottoman Turkish poet Ahmet Hashim died in 1933, Yakup Kadri wrote a biography of his friend. The image he painted in the biography was at least partially unflattering. Yakup Kadri described Hashim as always weakly, tired, anxious, pessimistic, and incessantly complaining about poor health. Yet in 1914, at the age of 30, Hashim became a reserve officer as Yakup Kadri stayed out of the war for health reasons. On his way to another front from Gallipoli, Hashim returned to Istanbul briefly. When the two friends met again, Yakup Kadri could not believe his eyes. Quote, "I was almost convinced that the reserve officer standing before me was a different man, a man completely different than Hashim. There was no sign of that Hashim who was always irritable, fussy, and lazy. Now his temperament and character seemed to be completely different. He had become absolutely optimistic," end quote. Hashim, quote, "had put on weight, become energetic, and looked at least 10 years younger from the time we first met," end quote. So manly and toughened was Hashim that he did not even need his ever-present cotton cardigan, Yakup Kadri says. For Yakup Kadri, what rescued Hashim from Hashim himself was his war service. Unfortunately, because he did not leave behind a memoir or diary, we cannot compare the two Hashims in his own words. A lieutenant in Gallipoli as well, Mehmet Fasih, resorted to describing himself in a diary he kept. 9 years younger than Hashim in 1915, Fasih also noticed changes only after several months of war service. Quote, "My age is 21, but my hair has already turned gray. My mustache is going gray as well. My face is all wrinkled. My body has deteriorated and become infirm," end quote. And these were only the physical changes he noted on that occasion. Looking not only at subaltern or junior officers, but also to the enlisted men as much as our sources allow, in this talk I will first explore the kinds of masculinist notions and assumptions with which the men were trained and inculcated during their military service, or to use the military's own word for it, when they were being educated. Living in a patriarchal culture, some of what the men heard or read in training would have been familiar already. Authorities certainly took advantage of these deeply ingrained pre-existing notions. In fact, they bolstered some of these and also built upon them to introduce relatively new ideas as well. The purpose was to motivate the men for the defense of Baton, or homeland, technically fatherland, since Baton is a masculine Arabic word, and keep their morale up for the war. Of course, there were other and more powerful notions and concepts the military authorities employed for this very purpose, but I'm focusing here only on those relating to masculinity. In the second part of my talk, I will try to highlight, even if tentatively, whether the kinds of normative expectations drilled into the men held against the violent reality of the war experience. I say tentative because mine is a work in progress. I want to suggest here that masculinity, namely what was passed on as military masculinity, played an important role in the way these men experienced the war. However, the war in turn deeply influenced the way they understood and experienced their masculine self. In other words, their understanding of masculine norms, whether brought from civilian life or learned through training, were what motivated them in war. But the same war also subverted this very masculinity through its everyday realities. Besides practical combat skills, what did the military authorities teach to the members of this military nation? Trying to produce a warrior ethos, men were given lessons on the kinds of traits that they were expected to possess. These are personal courage, endurance, stoicism, strength and skill, discipline, blind obedience to orders, of course, self-sacrifice for the greater good, and honor, or namus. For reasons of time, I cannot cover all these traits, but we will take a look at a few that are more directly related to masculinity. Courage, endurance, suppression of sentiment, and forbearance of pain and hardship were the kinds of masculine notions, manuals that the officers used to teach these notions to the soldiers. This is what they attempted to impart on the men. One of the motivational works, which were basically used as teachers' editions books, is what I'm going to call them, or manuals, immediately connected military service to manliness. Quote, courage means manliness. Soldiering means manliness. The dignity of manliness depends on one's ability to have forbearance in the face of all kinds of difficulties and to remain firm in purpose. Stoic and enduring soldiers won't get confused during most bloody and most dim times of warfare. Such soldiers would accept martyrdom as fame, being wounded as dignity, and not lose their fortitude, end quote. If soldiering meant manliness in this case, then those who did not do their soldiering or military service were not quite masculine or manly enough. Attempting to provide an education in manhood, officers probably kept close to what the text suggested for this purpose. Since courage and fearlessness would be a quality that any military would want to have in its soldiers, another manual reminded the men that they must, quote, stand like a citadel wall in front of the enemy, end quote. And anything less would prove someone namet, or a coward, or someone without courage. Excuse me. Further, the author noted that, quote, such cowardly soldier would be hated or detested even by his own mother, end quote. Whereas a man with courage, quote, would enjoy the sound of swords rattling, a coward would take the sounds of the wind or sound of the wind for swords rattling and run away, end quote. Telling men to be courageous and stand before the enemy like a citadel wall was meant to deal with the most important emotion on the battlefield, fear. Especially fear, when brought to surface, or when came to surface, likely exclusively determined one's behavior at moments of extreme danger. In other words, that was the moment a soldier decided between fight or flight, or he might become too stunned to move or act at all. Fear is considered to be an unmanly emotion, or was considered certainly. But as we will see later, Ottoman soldiers and officers had no qualms about discussing fear when writing about their war experience. If fear was the most important emotion in warfare, then we might expect motivational manuals to deal with it extensively. In this regard, soldiers might have found them disappointing indeed. Referring to traumatic and fearful experiences soldiers might face, many of these works, and I could even say all of them, collectively blunt in what they suggest. Quote, when the fighting starts, throw off your fear. Be forbearing in the face of terrifying experiences of war. Be enduring against the hardships of warfare, end quote. They do not explain how, but simply tell soldiers to suppress fear. While they were short in detail on how to deal with fear, the manuals did not leave the soldiers completely without help. Since fear was about fear of death or the unknown, a number of manuals use religious notion used a religious notion to deal with this particular issue. Recognizing the military utility of a non-military religious concept, especially that of Sufism, a number of motivational manuals pointed to the special importance of tevekkül, or tawakkul in Arabic, or fatalism, or putting one's trust in or depending upon God. One writer of these training manuals succinctly reflected what he might have called the human condition. Quote, when human beings find themselves in a dangerous situation, they always think of death. Death is life's most absolute, incomprehensible, and unavoidable event. As the moment of death is unknown, they have no choice but to completely surrender to this mysterious power, end quote. The key to tevekkül was the notion of surrender or resignation and feeling of being safe through acceptance of God's will or divine will. Adding that tevekkül was the most useful notion for a soldier before anybody else, the same writer asked, quote, isn't tevekkül the most respectable and courageous consolation for members of the military who suffer from various forms of deprivation, misery, and dreadful disasters during times of war, end quote. He also wrote that this notion existed among other religions and peoples, even if they might have been somewhat different. He was correct, for John Engel, a British soldier, told his parents in a letter that, quote, should it be God's will, I could not ask for a finer death, end quote. Seeing deprivations and disaster as part of God's plan and testing of human beings was meant to offer a sense of consolation because tomorrow might bring something different. In order to overcome the fear of suffering and death, the soldier needed to resign himself to God's will by trusting him. This would ideally lead to a state of tranquility through acceptance of destiny, therefore avoid fear. Tevekkül seemed to offer some hope to soldiers. Instead of believing just before an attack that death was inescapable, they could also feel some hope that they would die only if God had determined it in that way. Since there was nothing they could do for those who were pious enough to change their fate, the attempt for which would in fact amount to resistance to God's will and plan, soldiers would not run away but stand their ground, as the motivational manuals put, like a citadel wall. Some of you might be wondering what tevekkül has to do with masculinity. I will leave you in the dark for the moment, and I will return to this a little bit later. Another pre-existing traditional and patriarchal, in this case, idea that the military authorities and the manual writers took advantage to motivate the soldiers was none other than the concept of namus, or honor. Though sometimes translated as virtue or honor, it is, in its most common usage, namus refers to both the sexual integrity or chastity of female family members and a man's ability to provide for and defend his house, his female relations in particular, against threats from the outside world. Namus is closely linked to other concepts such as sheref, honor, urz, in this case also honor to a certain extent, but chastity as well, and izzet. Altogether, they're also connected to personal characteristics of courage, generosity, hospitality, wisdom, honesty, self-control, and avoidance of degradation of others. Anyone who could not or would not defend his namus or alternatively commit the kinds of acts it restricted was simply namussuz, or someone without honor. Ottoman military authorities knew that the men understood the notion of namus quite well. The issue was how to turn it into something about military service and more. The first step in this direction was to tell the men that they were there to defend the namus of their womenfolk from the enemy who might dare to invade their Baton, or homeland. Because one could not be sure that the men understood the same thing of Baton as their officers, someone needed to tell them that it was larger than their immediate birthplaces and included the whole Ottoman homeland. This teaching took the form of either lecturing to the soldiers, which the authorities called nasihat sessions, or getting them to memorize through rote learning certain questions and relatively short answers. And in fact, both the questions and the answers were given to the enlisted men in advance so they could memorize it and repeat it. One of these booklets meant for this purpose, and I call them, by the way, motivational literature or manuals, took the latter approach by asking questions with already provided canned answers. This was learning through repetition at its best. Question asked, who's a greater mother to you than your mother at home? Answer was, my Baton. Question again. This just goes like this, question, answer. So I won't read the Q&A part. Soldier, where is or what is your Baton? Answer, Ottoman lands. Why do you love your Baton so much? Because my existence as a human being, my namus, my name, my reputation are based upon it. My house, all my possessions, my ancestors, and my descendants are in Baton's embrace. What is the relationship between your Baton and the nation? Baton is the nation's mother. Baton is the nation's soul. What happens if the enemy touches your Baton? Its chastity and honor, or namus in this case, would be ruined. What would a soldier allow? Would a soldier allow this? Answer, soldiers live for namus and willingly die in order to maintain it. What would be the deed of those who turned their backs to the enemy? It would be to allow the enemy to violate your mother. So mother here, both Baton, but also one's own mother as well. Scholars have noted that the representation of the homeland as a female body in nationalist discourses served the purpose of constructing a national identity based on male bonding among a nation of brothers. Such nationalist discourse might have appealed to educated officers easily enough, but among large groups of illiterate men, and certainly the Ottoman soldiers were, it had to be couched in more traditional and perhaps explicit terms to increase purchase. Probably in terms of the soldiers had never heard or imagined before, the Ottoman Baton was gendered and turned into a female in need of protection and possession by men. As Efsane Najmabadi puts about Iran, quote, sexual and national honor intimately constructed each other, end quote. In this way, feminization of Baton under threat and in need of protection permitted its defense to be directly connected the soldiers' individual sense of namus and urz and national namus. At least as far as the soldiers could grasp it, both the nation and the Baton were likened to a large family. Another manual writer said, quote, what all this means is that we are all siblings, and Baton is all of our mother, end quote. Thus, the integrity of Baton was as near as one's personal namus. Some writers even included examples of courageous Ottoman women to remind the men of their masculine role in defending the womenfolk. One example was Kara Fatma, who, while in a secondary support role, as expected of women, obviously in this case, took the initiative and helped repulse a Russian attack against the city of Erzurum in 1887 when he noticed that the city was about to fall. Thus saving the city, Kara Fatma became, quote, a female lion, end quote, for one of the manual writers who asked, quote, if a female Ottoman behaves like this, how would a male Ottoman behave, end quote. The answer was ready, of course, like a male lion, end quote. Though it might seem otherwise, the story told about Kara Fatma does not threaten the gender dichotomy, but in fact reaffirms it. War was man's work. As one of their duties was to defend the honor and chastity of women, Kara Fatma, having to lead non-warriors in a last-ditch effort, is a powerful reminder that the men somehow almost failed. In other words, Kara Fatma is used here to shame the male soldier's sense of manliness and masculinity. As good as this exceptional woman was, men needed to do much better. They needed, in fact, to firmly hold on to their role as defenders of women and rescue the namus of manliness away from transgressing women. Obviously, all these things I have been talking about so far should be conceived only as military normative expectations of military officials. And as such, they're about ideals rather than experience. I'm interested also in whether these warrior codes withstood the reality of war experience after the training was over. The rest of my talk examines how fear and other emotions determined and degraded masculine behavior expected of the men. For some soldiers, first experience of war could be powerful and scar the memory forever. Originally the product of a religious education, that is to say a madrasa, with brief training as a reserve officer, Ottoman was already anxious about his future when he boarded the train in Istanbul, taken east towards the Caucasus front. Of course, he had to walk 40 days beyond the last train stop to get there. He would have other moments of doubt and fear immediately after arriving at the Caucasus front. But in his first mission, a Russian artillery shell exploded close to his location. Quote, it describes this situation like this. The earth shook. I lived through a very critical moment. I was in a trance. I was not myself. I had a fit of nerves. I admit it. I experienced a serious psychic shock and lost all my senses. I lost control of my bodily functions. I was not even aware that I urinated on myself. Clearly, I could not control myself or my willpower, end quote. In both cases of fear, well, I reported only one here, Halil tells us in his memoir, rather than in a war diary, which was written actually something like 20 years later, that his power of will eventually overcame his fear. The fact that he remembered these events decades later also tells us their long-lasting impression as well. Another junior officer described the fear he felt nearly 20 years after the event as well. So for some reason, there are these sort of trends. Immediately after war or 20 years later, for example, some of the memoirs appeared. I think this is particularly an intimate description of fear and the thin line between living and dying a horrible death. Caught under heavy and seemingly endless Russian artillery fire on the Galician front, where the Ottoman expeditionary unit was sent, Şevki, the officer, wrote, quote, can you imagine the horror of waiting just below the storm of steel that could at any moment tear you to pieces and throw your bits up in the air? A few direct hits nearby, we all look at each other's faces. An enlisted man who was near me is continuously praying in fear. I ask him, are you scared? He answers, no, I'm not, sir. My question is just as absurd as his answer was a lie, Şevki says, end quote. When they were caught in the Russian artillery fire in their trenches, this Ottoman unit had 81 men. When the barrage ended, they counted only 16 survivors, including the officer, author of the memoir. Several hours later, when the surviving members of the unit was resting, Şevki tried to catch some sleep. As he closed his eyes, he could see two of his men sitting down and staring at the ground instead of looking at each other. Sergeant Hilmi, one of the survivors, was telling Mehmet, who was pretty close to Şevki himself, quote, this is how it is, Mehmet. If Allah has not decided for you to die, then you don't die, end quote. This was tevekkül after the fact, presumably to deal with the survivor's guilt rather than fear ahead of time. It is impossible to judge the efficacy of tevekkül before or during a dangerous mission or near-death experiences. I will try to demonstrate this with an episode and a quote from the Battle of Gallipoli. On an average sort of day during the battle, Lieutenant Fassi visited his friend Agati, an Arab Ottoman, presumably from Syria. Fassi had recently delivered a beloved soldier's eulogy just a few days before, during which all the men present, even those, he says, battle-hardened enough so they had no tears left, cried. Upon arrival at his friend's trench sector, he found his friend Agati distressed, who explained that the previous night's reconnaissance mission into enemy trenches had failed because some of the men had refused to leave the trench and cried, quote, like woman, end quote, to be spared from the mission. They were simply scared and would not leave. Ordered again to try that night, Agati asked his sergeants to select 40 men and have one of the sergeants to volunteer in order to lead the unit. Fassi observed from sergeants' faces that they were worse off than Agati and had not, quote, even the least bit of morale left. They all seemed withdrawn and anxious. One could see the despair in their eyes, end quote. A little later, one of the sergeants, when Fassi was still there, returned to Agati's dugout to announce that they had picked the 40 men, but none of the sergeants, including himself, would volunteer to lead the mission. Agati, still looking distressed and just as unnerved as his men, Fassi decided to intervene directly. He wrote in his diary, quote, I asked the sergeant how many times he's been called under arms. 6 times, he said. I told him he's alive because the time decreed by fate for his death has not come. He would only die when that fated time came. I said his father's spirit looked down on him. I asked him how he was going to look at his wife, womenfolk, and other people in the face if he returned home with the reputation of being a coward. I told them if they continued to behave in this way, I would make a point of exposing them as cowards to everyone in our hometown of Mersin, end quote. The sergeant left without saying a word at all. Fassi appealed to 3 notions here to motivate and raise the morale of the unnamed sergeant, even if it was rather crude about it. And these notions are tevekkül and namus and warrior ancestors. Woman's sexual honor, the sergeant knew, was really all about his own namus, about his masculine duty to protect them. Although Fassi had his own moments of cowardice, but in his attempt to help his friend Agati and motivate the sergeant, he either knowingly or inadvertently asserted his position in a hierarchy of masculinities. From the foregoing, we are already familiar with, I'm not moving, so the light went out. Okay. From the foregoing, we're already familiar with the first 2 notions, but not with the warrior ancestors. This is the idea that sergeants' real or imagined warrior ancestors who had sacrificed themselves for the same land were both watching over and judging him as his man and his masculinity. Fassi, knowing that the kind of military training I referred to above included history lessons as motivational and masculinizing tool as well, was reminding the sergeant of his debt of honor or namus borger to his ancestors, who became the symbols of sacrifice, bravery, and manliness to be emulated. Warrior ancestors here should be understood in the larger sense. They could include Ottoman sultans and pashas, but also ordinary men like Sergeant Mehmet, who gained fame during the Battle of Gallipoli by holding down a large group of enemy soldiers invading the territory. Of course, the unnamed sergeant could possibly have more directly related warrior ancestors as well, but the aim was to suggest the emulation of these self-sacrificing warriors, whoever they might have been. One of the motivational manuals put it this way, quote, from one end of Anatolia to the other end of Romania or Rumeli, every little corner of the land contained buried martyrs. Seas and islands smelled of Ottoman blood. The stones of the Baton were the bones of our ancestors. Its soil is the raw essence, or the word here is külçe, of their bodies. The moisture of the soil is the blood of martyrs, end quote. In short, Baton was one large martyr cemetery, and the sergeant was honor-bound to protect the same Baton his ancestors had conquered and protected for the same reasons he was being asked to do now. Of course, the sergeant leaving without saying a word does not tell us whether he was suddenly motivated as the manuals expected him to be, or he realized that he had no real choice at all. Lieutenant Fassi also knew that the efficacy of such notions could be fleeting and needed to be repeated whenever needed. He also knew that despite all of his attempts not to show it to his men, he had frequent moments of fear as well. In fact, he would have said Agati's fault here was to show his fear to his men. This is why he couldn't order them to do certain things, and his men also became demoralized when their officer was. Mehmet Fasih's diary features a number of episodes where he admits that he has become, in his own words, a near coward, which here has to be interpreted as unmanly. Having been wounded already, he knew about how quickly things could change in war. Whenever he could catch some sleep in his underground dugout, he had the feeling that the whole thing would collapse on him and bury him alive until he died. When he expresses this fear, but he is so tired and must sleep, he usually says, with tevekkül on his mind, with tevekkül on my mind, I close my eyes. So he ends up sleeping anyway. So at least for him, in terms of sleeping, tevekkül seems to have worked. Since we return to tevekkül here, it's time to say something about its relationship to masculinity, as mentioned earlier. Scholars of the First World War in Europe have also written about the European version of tevekkül as well. Fatalism is what they call it, as we can tell from the foregoing, as a way of dealing with, this was a way of dealing with constant anxiety. For some, it undermined the idea of sacrifice. When I say here for some scholars, it undermined the idea of sacrifice. In the long run, some of these arguments added, by denying, let me do this again, pardon me. In the long run, scholars argue, fatalism, by denying men's ability to exercise control over their own fate, it challenged their manliness. This is a question I will have to continue to explore in the case of Ottoman soldiers, but I don't have a direct answer on it at the moment. I have not explored shell shock in this paper at all, especially for the Ottoman Empire. This is a much more complex topic and perhaps needs a separate talk or a paper to do it justice. Diaries and memoirs of soldiers' future experiences and episodes that anyone would qualify as nervous breakdown experiences. Ottoman psychiatrists, even if they believe that mostly only weak-willed men and those who already had an underlying mental condition broke down in war, but not because of the war, have left behind a few sources in this regard as well. So obviously, it goes without saying that if men broke down in war, this was the ultimate sort of degradation of manliness from the perspective of not so much the soldiers or officers themselves, but from the perspective of certainly those who didn't participate in the war and psychiatrists. In his meticulously kept diary, Lieutenant Fasih portrays the reality of warfare without holding back anything. He's quite explicit actually in what he describes. He had his moments of private rebellion against the war and against his superiors, cried for comrades who died, but never for himself or out of fear. He also had moments of fear, but he always came back to carry out his duty, even if day by day it became more and more difficult to deal with the front life. Suffering because of the war and as men is all over the pages of diaries and memoirs of a number of soldiers. Although the stories told in the first-person literature are naturally about the self, but in terms of suffering, or when they mention suffering, these men also saw their trials and tribulations as being the experience of their generation collectively. The young officer Shevki that we met in the trenches in Galicia during the Russian artillery barrage had something to say about this as well. During that same episode, as he saw his soldiers die one by one and expected that he might be next, he compared their situation or his own situation to a sacrificial lamb. Quote, even the situation of a tied up sacrificial lamb awaiting a knife is not as tragic as the circumstances of a human child like us in this circumstance. At least the lamb would be unaware of the disaster about to befall upon it. It is this waiting in fear that has turned my generation's hair to gray, a generation that became old without ever having experienced youth, end quote. Mehmet Fasih, too, saw his suffering as the common experience of his generation. Though he always wrote in the first person, whenever he expressed such sentiments, he switched to first person plural. Fed up with the war, front life, and losing comrades and his own soldiers, he says, quote, "If it were possible to die twice, we could get used to that as well," end quote. Since courage and bravery came in limited quantities, it was bound to be exhausted. At that point, it became impossible to express fear and other emotions. Fear was or became a constitutional reaction to war, and it was common and commonly expressed in diaries and memoirs. Secondly, while soldiers also make occasional references to normative expectations about courage and tevekkül, their writings feature more frequent and vivid descriptions of fear and disturbing emotions and images caused by the war or its consequences. The first-person narratives used here show both the complexity and diversity of the emotional reactions of the soldiers to the conditions in which they found themselves. I suggest that this back and forth between the expectations and the reality of internal and mental reactions is an indication of their attempt to juggle and find some balance between the two, corresponding to each person's emotional makeup. This is evidence of cracks in the pre-war monolithic military manliness. Yet it's going to take a little bit of time to define this exactly and requires a little bit more research. But cracks were visible in other ways as well. The reality of the mental, emotional collapse due to fear reactions or other emotions was in complete contrast to the pre-war manly and heroic norms. In a chapter I published recently, actually edited by Kate Fleet and Ebru Boyar, on the Ottomans and entertainment, I suggested following Iris Rakamimov's analysis that at least some men who became prisoners of war during the war experienced, quote, a sense of masculine disempowerment, end quote, because of their captivity. Perhaps not nearly to the same degree at all, but we might consider the possibility, especially the enlisted men who were obviously at the bottom of the hierarchical order in terms of power, may have experienced something similar even without being captured. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've got one question already in the Q&A. If anybody wants to add anything, then please just type it into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and I'll read them out. The first question for you is, do oral sources such as folk music help in understanding attitudes towards masculinity and how they changed as a result of the First World War and by extension the Balkan Wars preceding it and the Greco-Turkish War that followed?
Great question. So I considered using folk songs actually many years ago for outside of the question of masculinity, because this is a more recent project. And I have some methodological issues with those, because one, it is really about, I'm more interested about how soldiers themselves viewed their own masculinity rather than the outsiders, the civilians. So that's one issue. So this tells us something about how the society felt about, what the soldiers experienced, but it's a different kind of question than I'm exploring. And to be honest, among the many I examined, in terms of masculinity, it's difficult to come by these kinds of folk songs. And I would be happy to learn if the person who's asking the question here, I see the name, has some to suggest so that I could take a look at it. But those are certainly some sources to be explored about the civilian attitudes towards masculinity.
Great, thank you very much. Then the next question is that you mentioned shell shock, and was there an understanding of this condition, or was it usually dismissed as linked to the underlying weakness of those who suffered from it?
So there was really no understanding of it. From the soldiers' perspective, I mean, British soldiers, the term actually comes from the British soldiers themselves from World War I. Later on, it was adopted by British doctors, and by 1917, actually, the term itself was outlawed, that both in Germany and in the UK. German version was, of course, in German. But in Turkey, this term actually was not used at all. for a number of years during the war, it seems that medical officers who were attached to military units dismissed the sort of psychological reactions of the soldiers simply because they thought the soldiers were malingering, that is, feigning illness. So instead of sending them to Istanbul, where there were the only psychiatrists really in the Ottoman Empire, which amounted to a total number of 12 or 14 for the whole empire, they tended to sort of punish these men for malingering. A few officers were, of course, sent to the front. I'm sorry, to the hospitals in the rear in Istanbul mainly. Soldiers themselves, there's no sort of evidence that they understood this. I mean, they simply see it as mental breakdown during wartime. From the perspective of the psychiatrists, actually, the fuller development of this really occurs after the war itself. And it's sort of with resignation, with passive statements that they discovered that there were many cases of not so much shell shock, but hysteria or neurasthenia. In fact, this was the term both the British doctors and the German doctors used by the end of 1917 among the soldiers, and that they went undiagnosed, mostly because of the battalion doctors not recognizing and therefore not referring these conditions to Istanbul psychiatrists. So there's some research on this. As far as I know, I'm the only one who works on it. I have a chapter in my book that sort of examines it briefly in the context of prisoners of war. But I have a chapter I'm working independently for anthology. I don't know when it might come out since it's an anthology, but something will appear relatively soon, I guess I will say. I lost track of the questions. Eve, are you?
I'll read out the next one. Yeah, this is from someone who recently read Ben Turkish captive soldiers in the Korean War. They proved to be more resistant than other nationalities. The questioner assures their training had a part to play. Have you looked at the Korean War?
Yes, I have. In fact, when I first started, obviously, are we talking about, I guess I need to understand the question a little bit better. In terms of, are we talking about in terms of masculinity of the fighting men, since I brought up prisoners of war, because the question says proved to be more resistant than other nationalities. Generally, what's expressed about I didn't read the book Ben Turk, I should say. Usually, whenever some literature, secondary literature appears about the Korean War veterans, it's really about the prisoners of war. Because while the American prisoners of war succumbed, it seemed to Chinese propaganda, Turkish prisoners of war did not. And there are various explanations for this. From the American perspective, one explanation, I don't know if this is true, is that the Koreans, the Chinese didn't have enough Turkish speakers to brainwash the Turkish prisoners of war. That's why the Turkish prisoners of war successfully resisted the propaganda. I don't know how true this is. When I started my research initially on prisoners of war, I met a number of Korean war veterans and talked about this. They actually didn't want to talk about prisoners of war at all, but they were happy to talk about their war experiences on which I was not working. So I'm sorry now I didn't take my time to do more of that, since their numbers are obviously dwindling quite a bit. So I took a long time to answer Chidam Balim here, but basically I read some English literature on the Korean War, some memoirs of Korean War veterans, and I will make a note of reading Ben Turk as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from the chat now, which is, do we find any references to or examples of masculine qualities of other nations in these teaching manuals? And secondly, what do we know about the non-Muslim Ottoman soldiers and their reaction to this relationship between masculinity and tefakkür?
Yeah, great questions, both of them. So Germans come up and French come up. Not necessarily in terms of, they come up in terms of Napoleon, for example. At how Napoleon also practiced, tefakkür, obviously in the French version. Some of these manuals also talk about In fact, some are critical of this, but they also talk about especially Prussian, but German sort of military qualities as well. The critical ones say, why are we talking about these German or Prussian military qualities? We have the same qualities. We're a warrior nation. We should talk about our own ancestors, our own warriors, etc. But these are not detailed sort of examinations. What happens in the early 20th century, namely, I would guess, I haven't done a sort of a survey of this, possibly after 1908, but maybe even before that. Some of these manuals show the influence of European works, similar works that were obviously read by European soldiers. Many are German, some are Russian in this case, but in terms of sort of direct qualities of European soldiers, they don't have that many details. The second part of the question was about non-Muslim soldiers or non-Turkish. I guess it's almost the same thing. So I have, I don't have a good deal to say on this, partially because I'm behind. Reading something that I discovered through reading the memoirs of reading a Rum soldier in the Ottoman military who left behind an anonymous soldier, his memoir. I was able to find, after months of searching, a copy of a manual of this sort. I'm trying to remember the title directly, but it's basically motivational manual for Christian soldiers of the Ottoman Empire. And it's written in Greek letters, but in Karamanlı. So all I need to do, I was told, learn the Greek alphabet and be a little creative in my pronunciation, and I will be able to read it. But I haven't had the time to learn the Greek alphabet in order to learn this. I'm very curious, in fact, what similar manuals, and this is a lengthy one, in fact, something around the 150 pages range, I could be wrong, to see whether there are similar concepts here or how they differ. I'm suspecting that it's going to be rather similar, but that's only a guess at this point.
Thank you. One question is saying you're, as usual, ahead of the curve, and then the question is that what will you be doing going forward with your insights and sources on religious beliefs as part of the military masculine mindset, considering that our secular generation doesn't often take into account what people believed, so it's hard to find good work on the subject?
Well, in terms of how I'm planning this next project, I think religion will be sort of a rather small part of it, because I want to examine this in the context of masculinity, right? So it will come up whenever it comes up. I think I will certainly have a chapter on sort of both the concept of maybe examine everything in a single chapter, the way I'm planning it right now, on jihad and martyrdom. Certainly both what the soldiers were told and how they understood this, and how they understood it and how they practiced it will be the difficult part, obviously. Certainly in the memoirs I have, or diaries I have read so far, the evidence is somewhat thin. There are memoirs certainly written by madrasa graduates. Those fall into a different sort of category, and they are obviously very informative about such notions. But as I said, I'm at the rather early stages of this, still planning it, reading the sources. I'll see what develops out of it.
Great. There's also a recommendation when it comes to the analysis of folk songs and soldiers' experiences in World War I, which is the PhD of Franziska Davies, Muslims in the Russian Army, 1874 to 1917, which might be helpful.
Okay, great.
The next question that remains unexamined for a whole host of reasons is men raping men in wartime as a way of asserting their masculinity, as ways of expressing their sexuality in a time when they could be imprisoned or worse for being homosexual and more. Have you come across more on this subject in your sources?
They come up on occasion, but these are rather brief. I'm trying to remember how many times I encountered, but relying on my memory is not a good thing. I think I encountered it less than a dozen times. Usually it's about someone who's already suspect because of his behavior as an unpleasant person. There's certainly, usually, I guess, obviously it would make no difference, but I'm trying to remember now. I think everything I encountered in this regard, in terms of the memoir, has been about experiences on the Eastern Front, simply because I guess the warfare was different. People were isolated. Therefore, there were sort of moments or, where this kind of thing could occur. Obviously, I don't have any evidence of it from someone, unlikely that soldiers would write about it themselves. They only write about people who suffered such a thing. And it's usually about something almost happened rather than something happened. But these men usually have reputations for doing such things. So yes, absolutely, this is a power issue. It will get some coverage, but as I said, the evidence is rather thin. It is possible that there might be some documents about this in the military archives, but I know some such documents will probably not be, let's say, readily available.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question is that you mentioned that you're more interested in the soldier's point of view than the view of outsiders. The first reference you gave was to Yaqub Qadri's narrative on the evolution of Ahmed Hashim's manliness through war. To the knowledge of the questioner, Yaqub Qadri has never fought in the First World War. He observed the war as a journalist, mostly through Istanbul. Does this not make him an outsider, or is the condition for being an outsider to not be a man, since folk music is often associated with women's lamentations?
Yeah, very good point here. I was reluctant to actually use Yaqub Qadri here, but I wanted to use one example of someone who in several months had suffered the kind of should we say aging that Mehmet Fassi talks about, versus someone who was not in the war himself, but was viewing someone who went to service at the age of 30 and within a few months looked 10 years younger than the original date that they met, right? So it seemed as if, Ahmed Hashim went from being 30, 31 years old to, I don't know when they met exactly, something like 15 years old. So I was trying to sort of juxtapose the kind of sort of images on the one hand, both a soldier sort of viewed about himself and those outsiders. So this is why I also added that it's unfortunate that Ahmed Hashim never talked about his war experience, never left anything behind except a sentence or two here and there. And I think he was frustrated with people who told him to write something about it. And if my memory is correct here, I think he ended up telling them basically, maybe not to Yaqub Qadri himself, that while he was known as Arab Hashim, and I don't think he liked this term, even though it was uttered endearingly, he said he was the Arab Hashim, but he was the only one among his peers who went to serve in the war. Obviously, I'm not making a judgment about the folk songs here. It's just that if possible, I want to keep the focus on how the men viewed themselves as much as possible. If that's not possible, then I will have to turn to those kinds of folk songs, lament songs, in order to sort of, make the work better than it would be otherwise.
Thank you.
Thank
Somebody's asking a question related to their own research into Czech World War I soldiers' masculinity in Austria-Hungary, which is, did the soldiers in your sample experience some tension resulting from their role of providers as dictated by masculine honor and their inability to actually provide for their families while in service, or women taking over that role?
Yeah, I might even know who's asking this question. I just read the work. I can't see the names here. So they don't necessarily express this at all, that I haven't encountered. They certainly worry about their families. And I think this was more of an issue for the enlisted men, but the enlisted men were overwhelmingly illiterate, right? So those officers, I think, usually come from families that were slightly better off, and therefore there was somebody, a brother, a father, or some sort of income taking care of the family. I know that enlisted men's families were paid by the state when their only sort of relative went off the war, therefore the income was lost, but these monies, Yuccan tells us, were rather small and inadequate for the soldiers. So the soldiers do worry about their families, how they were sort of dealing with the difficulties of war, how they were dealing, if many of them peasants, obviously, for the agricultural work, etc. And I think rather than writing about, because they're illiterate, one of the ways they react to this is, as some recent works tell us, is through desertion, right? So they're worried about it. They can't write about it to deal with it in that way. And one way they can, try to get ahead of this is to resort to desertion in order to go see if their families are doing okay. And I know this is certainly sort of outside of the bounds of the question that was asked. But this is one way they deal with it, certainly. And in the absence of, memoirs or diaries by enlisted men, we have only a few, and it doesn't come up in any of those. This is the best sort of we can sort of say at the moment.
At this point, I just want to check whether you have time for 4 more questions. There's
Me?
4 more that I can see in
I have time.
Is that okay?
I finished last of my classes yesterday, so
okay.
a lot of grading, but it can wait.
Okay, so the next question is, can we establish a relationship between Gaza ideology and masculinity to learn if there's any information about the differences in the understanding of masculinity of the classical period wars fought with the Gaza ideology and the one existing during World War I?
I think certainly a connection could be established. In fact, these manual writers established a connection in terms of not so much directly with masculinity, but in order to sort of, I guess there's an indirect relationship there. If not direct, I'd have to think about this a little bit more deeply. There was a certain sort of recurring theme of emulating both sort of medieval wars, Islamic wars. In fact, in order to save time, I took out a couple of references made to the Prophet himself. One was about Qadr, or fate, basically. And there's a good work, the name of the author is not coming to me right now, as to Muhammad as the exemplar of war that was used as motivational tool for these soldiers. As well. And frequently, when I said these Ottoman warriors, the warrior ancestors are mentioned, the early Islamic wars come up as well. Therefore, Gaza, jihad are certainly part of it. I'll be honest, maybe whoever's asking the question is going to say, you haven't thought deeply enough, but I haven't quite made that connection. I guess I'll have to think about it seriously. I'll take some notes here about making that connection between Gaza and masculinity.
I will also send you all these questions. So
that would be great, because I noticed some very, very good ones and some messages as well. Thank you.
And there's lots of thanks as well. There's one quick question, which is, I think, a follow-up from when you were talking before about the how you would carry on with the role of religion and how it relates to masculinity. If Allah and Jehovah are considered to be male gods, surely it plays a role in masculinity self-perceptions. Then the next question is, in the beginning you mentioned the narrative about a soldier who gained some weight and looked better. I wonder if there were more bodily, physical aspects of masculinities at the time. Were the discourses influenced by scientific racism or racial sciences at the time? For example, Chinese nationalists at the same time were intensively worrying that Chinese men had fewer muscles.
Part of the work will be obviously looking at the physical tests men had to endure in order to, during training. I haven't read the sources on this, but I doubt that I'm going to find these kinds of things. I certainly find that kind of material. You know, if we're talking about racism here, obviously maybe about non-Muslim or non-Turkish minorities, but the psychiatrists who mostly wrote after the war about these kinds of things and certainly speak to physical, both abilities and physical sort of, what's the word I'm looking for here? Well, it's not coming to me right now. Muscular abilities and trying to remember the word they used, their constitution basically, right? In the 1920s and 30s, the way men's bodies looked, they figured also determined whether they were degenerate or not, for example. So some sort of a physical deformity directly implied that there was mental sort of degeneration and deformity as well. But this only comes from the psychiatrists. And in fact, they complained that military medical doctors who are not specialists, right, tended to accept for military service even men who should have been disqualified, right? And this was sort of, I guess this was in the back of my mind. This is why I made the reference to Hashim and Yaqub Qadri. You know, another reason for this actually, that, you know, when Hashim was, Qadri was describing him as sickly, weak, fussy, you know, he would fall over if you touched him, etc. Yet he passes through the military medical examination and becomes this more robust, more manly sort of a person. But I haven't encountered any of the kind of comments the colleague is asking in this question.
Are you able to grade various masculinities mentioned in the manuals and soldiers' ego documents? And does the Balkan War echo in these manuals and the soldiers' narratives?
Yeah. Sure, the manuals, actually, there was an increase in the number of manuals, even though there's a very short time period, right, between the end of the Balkan War and World War I. So, you know, during that time period, somebody has to write the manual and it has to be published. And in fact, you know, these kinds of things continue to be published throughout the war. So in some of them, we see references to the Balkan Wars, right? And in fact, they are written because of the result of the Balkan War. That is to say, it was a disaster and we need to do something. So there are references, for example, in those to loyalties of, some of them, to loyalties of non-Muslim Ottoman soldiers on the one hand, and two, relatively frequent references to that, you know, the disaster happened because one, men were not trained enough, both physically and mentally. This is why there's this urgency to train them in a different sort of way. In fact, for something else, I was writing for a project. I encountered an advertisement in a newspaper, right? And in fact, it's an advertisement by the Ministry of War that is asking for, let's see, men of religion or writers or officers, retired or currently active, to write these kinds of manuals, right? And it describes it. It's sort of out of my reach. I could, yeah, it is out of my reach. Maybe it is reach. I can find it quickly, but it basically gives an outline of what they're looking for, right? If I'm going completely from memory here, it has, you know, it either as separately or in a larger book. It has to have a history section because history is very important. And what happens here is that, again, those warrior ancestors, and they also want to tell the soldiers, for example, the past victories, but also defeats, right? Because one is supposed to learn from the defeats. There are actually little booklets called Acı Hikayeler, or tragedies that befell upon us, right? This is to create that sort of sensibility of, you know, in a way, revenge, to right the wrong, in some ways. And the most wrong to right at that point by 1914 actually is the Balkan War itself, right? Because they see this as a complete disaster, and the treatment from their perspective of Muslims living in the Balkans, etc., becomes an important aspect of these manuals. You know, there's a section on Elifba, or to teach the men how to read and write. There's a section on geometry, mathematics, etc., these kinds of things. So this is why they could claim that this was a real education. But if you look at the contents, and in fact, if you look at the advertisement, the only thing where they are not asking for some sort of a context or a connection to warrior qualities is the mathematics and geometry section, right? Because it's difficult to do it. Certainly, you know, American jihad made in Afghanistan had questions about that, about bullets traveling to hit Russian soldiers. So none of that is here for sure. But everything, even about religion and even Elifba, could be connected directly to these kinds of warrior qualities, right? That examples had to come from these kinds of things, it says in the advertisement, right? Examples should come from these kinds of things to highlight the qualities of warrior qualities and manliness. It doesn't quite say manliness, but I might have to go back in the advertisement. It certainly comes up in the manuals themselves. And there was taken out too long to answer this, but there was another part of that. I don't want to overlook it, or if we have many more questions, I'm happy to move on as well.
We have one more question.
Okay.
Which is whether military manuals issued for World War I to Ottoman soldiers the result of German military training and therefore German influence?
I'm going to say no. There might be some German influence in the increasing numbers of these kinds of things, but I also think it's because of the Young Turk Revolution in 1908. And of course, one could make the argument that those officers themselves were influenced by Germany, right? So it's difficult to avoid this German influence either directly or indirectly. But we have late 19th century examples of these kinds of things as well. So before, obviously, you know, Germany had been involved in training of Ottoman soldiers since the 19th century. You know, Golch Pasha, or Wonder Goltz, was in the Ottoman Empire to train the generation of officers, like, you know, I guess it would be a little bit early, but through ideology, I guess I'm going to say, officers like Enver Pasha, Mustafa Kemal, etc. So there's German influence, but I don't think they're coming out, you know, out of nothing simply because there's German influence. There might be influence in the number of increasing numbers of these kinds of manuals. But I could also say it's also after 1908. It's also part of this initial liberalization disappearing of censorship. And this kind of stuff would not have been censored anyway, but if you look at it, it's the War Ministry who's sort of calling out for these kinds of things in newspapers, inviting authors to write these kinds of things. And once they're purchased, it becomes I guess, a property of the Ministry of War. And there's sort of a first prize and a second prize, but not only for two kinds of works. You know, there could be multiple first prizes, for example. It just depends on the quality. So I don't know in total how many of these they published. I'm going to guess, you know, from 1908 to 1914, about 10 to 15, but there are also officers who are writing these kinds of things that might not necessarily belong into this category of motivational manuals, but it is something they use in the training of their own officers, but they don't necessarily go through this War Ministry sort of competition process.